Okay, 13.3 vascular plants with seeds. We're going to start out with a group that we call the Gymnosperms. The Gymnosperms are plants that are evergreen. So into this we would have like the pines, the fir, the spruce, the yews, and all those kind of plants that you can think of that are sort of like that are Gymnosperms. And they're called that because their seeds actually have no fleshy material over the outside of it. So we call them like having naked seeds. I don't know if any of you have ever looked at a pine cone in the forest, you know, like you picked your own when you went to the forest, not one that you get in a bunch of stuff for decorations. But if you look inside those little spiny parts, you know, that are spread apart, if you look down inside, you can see quite often seeds that are still inside there that you can maybe like take a tweezers and pull them right out. They have nothing covering them. The seeds are just bare. They often have a little bit of membrane around the outside so that when they fall out of the cone, the wind can maybe take them someplace else. Because you know, a seed that drops right below a tree might sprout and grow, but it'll be stunted, won't it? It'll never grow to its full height because it's being shaded by a tree above it. So we need to have that seed get launched away from the tree in a way. And so that's the reason why a lot of trees have their seeds made so that the wind can take them somewhere. Like in spring when we have maples, you know, those little helicopters, the winds can blow them a great distance away so they can sprout and they won't have a tree. They're not growing under another tree. They have all the sun for themselves. These are non-flowering. In other words, they don't have petals on the outside. They kind of have flower parts, but you don't see the classic petals, you know, it's brightly colored and things like that. So this is, if you would take a pine cone and you would slice it in half, this is kind of what it would look like at the top. These are those little sharp, hard things on the outside after they have dried and they open up. At first they're tight against each other, so you can't even see inside there where the seeds are forming. Okay, another kind of vascular plant are called the angiosperms, and they have their seeds enclosed in something, often in some fleshy material. Like an apple, you have the seeds and then you have the part on the outside that you eat, or a pear, or a peach, or lemon, lime, you know, all those have something fleshy around the outside of it. Their seeds are enclosed. Quite often they bloom. You know, we have apple trees. We have people across the street that have some apple trees and they will blossom in spring, so they have flowers. Cherry, you know, like for instance in Washington, D.C., they have don't they have a cherry festival or something like that? Because they have all these bright pink cherry blossoms. I think the cherry trees, weren't they a gift to us from Japan, I think, to the U.S.? Now here is the gymnosperm. Here is the one kind of cone, and then these things down here, which don't last all that long, are the other kind of cones. So, and this phylum to which these belong are called the conifera. If I start it wrong, I always pronounce it wrong. Coniferophida. There we go. Coniferophida. I got the emphasis in the right spot on that one. But these are trees that have some kind of cone on them. They don't all have to look exactly the same like you see on a pine tree. This is the largest phylum, it says, of gymnosperms. They produce seeds, but the seeds are inside the cone, and only when the cone dries and kind of spreads open can you see the seeds on the inside. I've tried taking the seeds out of those and trying to grow a pine tree, and I wasn't successful. And sometimes some of these seeds will not sprout until they've experienced certain kind of environmental conditions. Like some of them won't sprout until they pass through freezing times. So if they never froze, they will never sprout. There's some seeds that are they're inside of fleshy material that gets hard after a while, and they won't ever sprout until a forest fire goes by and it burns off the outside. And then you think that would kill the plant on the inside, but no, it releases the plant from the inside to be able to sprout. So different conditions for different plants. So it could be that, since evergreens typically are usually found where the temperature is below freezing. We had an Austrian pine in front of our house in Phoenix. And yes, you think of Phoenix. Does it ever freeze there? Yeah. Maybe like 3 or 4 days a year. It might drop below freezing, and then it's only for a couple hours. Not like here we can have sometimes weeks where the temperature doesn't even get above freezing, but not there. But it grew quite well. I never did see any others growing. I'll take that back. Yes, I did see others growing. So apparently the seeds from an Austrian pine don't need to go through freezing necessarily, because they would grow up in the rocks. It's kind of interesting. In Phoenix, people do have patches of grass. Most of you have whole yards full of grass. We had little patches of grass. The rest of it's covered with gravel. And you would rake your gravel to make it look nicer. I believe it sounds kind of crazy, but that's what we would. And it actually would look different. The side facing up would get bleached out by the sun and look pretty blah looking. When you would rake it, the right side of the rock would be on top, and it looked much better. So kind of weird, different things in different parts of the world. Okay, so these little things that grow out in spring produce pollen. Just like other trees, other plants produce pollen. They produce these in these special cones called pollen cones, and pollen is often kind of a yellow color. I know our Austrian pine would produce an awful lot of pollen. There'd be times when the ground was just covered with yellow pollen. But they only last a certain period of time, and then they dry up, and then rain or whatever will knock them off when it did rain. And then this would be the male part, and this would be the female part. That's the part that produces the seed. So we need the pollen grains to get onto the seed cone and get down inside and fertilize the eggs that are inside the seed cone. Okay, so here are the parts that you have of the pine tree life cycle. Here's the female part of the pine tree, and then this is the male part. The pollen grains from here have to get into or onto the cone, the seed cone, and it will grow. The pollen will actually grow a little tube down here and fertilize the seed that's inside of here. And after it's fully mature, the cone will open up. Quite often it doesn't open up until either late summer or maybe even not until the next year when they kind of open up. So it doesn't all happen, real quickly like a lot of crops we have around here. And then this seed, you can kind of see them. They often like laying inside there, and you take a little tweezers, you can pull them out. Sometimes they're loose already, so that if you bang the cone on the side, you'll have these little round things, not very big around, maybe about that big around, but they're not very thick either. They have a little bump in the middle where the seed is, and then they have a little membrane around the outside of it. And then, that could potentially grow into another pine tree. So here is the seed falling out of the cone after these have spread open. At first, they're really tight and protect the seed while it's forming. Okay, then we have Anthophyta. These are the flowering plants. So when you think of flowering plants, most of them belong to this phylum. We often call those also angiosperms. They're kind of like the dominant vegetation that you typically see. You know, we have our part of Nebraska here, we have lots of vegetation growing here, not like it was in parts of New Mexico and Arizona where not much grows there. Here we have just about everything is covered with some kind of plant, grass, trees, you know, whatever. It's our dominant vegetation. A lot of these have nice, pretty flowers. Like I was talking about cherry blossoms. This would, I think, might be even a cherry blossom, but I'm not sure. When they form their seeds are inside of the female structure, which is called the ovary, where the eggs are produced, and the ovary will mature into some fleshy fruit that birds and animals and humans like to eat. So when you're eating, for instance, a peach, that fleshy part on the outside is the mature ovary, and it had an ovum or an egg on the inside that got fertilized by pollen from that tree or another tree. Here's an apple, for instance. Okay, this is the outside of the ovary, and this is the stem right here. At this end may have been where the petals were located originally when the apple tree bloomed, but then they dry up, fall off, and then you have this fruit right here. This will serve to provide moisture and nutrients for the seed when it sprouts. Okay, now in the angiosperms, one way of looking at them is by looking at their seed. And is the seed have just one single piece, or could it actually be broken into two pieces? Like, for instance, like beans, particularly like lima beans, you know, sometimes they can split in half. Okay, that means it has two of something. Now, a monocotyledon would be like corn. When a kernel of corn sprouts, it sends a little shoot up above ground. It grows the roots down in the ground, but it shoots a little root up. It will often take the piece of the seed up, but it comes up with just one piece. So we call that monocotyledon, because it has just one of these. When you look at monocotyledon, you can tell it's probably that belongs to that category if you look at the leaves. The veins in the leaves, see these little lines in here? Those are the veins in the leaves. Those are the vascular tissue that carry water and nutrients. They all run parallel to each other, kind of like parallel to the edges of the leaf. So, like if you've ever looked at corn leaves, right? The veins grow along it, so corn would be a monocotyledon. Do leaves of grass look similar? Yep, so grass growing in your lawn is a monocotyledon. And the way these veins run, we call that venation. And what shape of venation it has, we call it parallel. That's parallel venation. So if we were trying to use, remember that key that you use to identify different animals? You can have one of those for plants. I used to have, when I taught biology many years ago in Kansas City, one of their fall projects before the trees lost all their leaves was to have a leaf collection. And you'd have many different, and you had to learn how to identify them. And one of the things we'd use for identifying them is looking at the veins in the leaves. That's because they belong to certain categories because of that. Okay? And when you look at the flowers of these plants like that, the flowers often have their parts in groups of 3 or groups of 6. Like for instance, this one right here, which is called a what? You know what this flower is from? Isn't it kind of lily? Okay, and notice how many parts it has. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 parts. Okay, so you can tell that a lily belongs to a monocotyledon. If you were ever to see a lily sprout, it would just have one piece that would come up, one cotyledon. The other kind has 2 halves, like the beans would be an example of that. And they have 2 of these fleshy parts that will they're actually the seed, but they'll split in half and the shoot will come out in between them and they'll kind of drag it up above ground and you'll see these 2 fleshy pieces, sort of like the picture I had yesterday was a better one probably that, but this is where they're kind of dragging these 2 halves up like this and then it'll swing up and stand upright. So this part kind of grows up faster than it can pull these 2 halves out of the ground, but eventually they get them dragged out of the ground and they'll flip around and face up and then the leaves will start to form above that. Okay, now their leaves are netted venation. Sort of like if you'd look at a Christmas tree or an evergreen tree that's lost all its needles. Notice that, these look like the branches of your Christmas tree or evergreen tree that have lost all their needles. Actually, I have one of my scars I have in my hand. It's very faint anymore. I made that when I was 2nd or 3rd grade. It was after Christmas, probably in spring. I found this old rusty razor blade on the ground and I was trying to cut the branches off of an old Christmas tree I'd found in the backyard. We were living in Omaha at the time and I cut my hand open with my rusty razor blade and didn't want my parents to know that I first had been doing that. But it healed up nicely. I had just this really faint little scar, but scars last a long time. Okay, now look at their flower parts. Are they 3 or 5? 3 or 6. This one has how many? This has 5. Okay, so 5 is kind of common number of petals that a flower that belongs to the dicotyledons. So that's just one way of grouping plants. Now let's look at the different parts of the plant. The plant, what I would call plant organs. Remember, that's more than one tissue working together to perform a larger function. So we have what we call vegetative organs. Into this we belong the leaves, the stems, and the roots. Leaves, the stems, and the roots. Then we have reproductive structures that are part of the plant, a way that it reproduces itself. Could be, like we said, having seed cones and pollen cones, or having flowers with anthers that have the little, produce the pollen, and in the middle is this thing that looks kind of like a vase. That's the pistil, which is the female part of the flower. Okay? And so flowers and fruits and seeds are part of the organs. That's the reproductive organ of a plant. Then let's look at it also from tissues. Just like the outside of your body is covered with skin, plants have something comparable to that. They have kind of like the skin on the outside, which we call the dermal layer. Our dermal layer is made up of multiple layers. And we actually name the degrees of burn that you might have, like a 1st degree, 2nd degree, or 3rd degree burn. Depends on how many layers of tissue of the dermal layer have been damaged by the burn. 1st degree means it's just really just the outside, probably, it'll blister a little bit, but if you keep it from getting an infection, you'll probably heal up fine. Okay, vascular tissue that's the kind that carries all the water and the nutrients. Okay, the water and the nutrients. So, and we'll talk about those later, but there's like something called xylem and phloem. You know, like we have arteries and veins, they have xylem and phloem. Okay, then we have ground tissue. Its job is for supporting. In other words, like, so plants don't just lay as blobs on the ground, they stand upright so they can display their leaves in such a way to get the maximum exposure to the sun. And also for storing food, you know, like potatoes store their food. Then we have meristematic. Meristematic, remember when we talked about stem cells? You know, they can differentiate and become all kinds of tissues possible from that. Well, these are cells in the plant that aren't stems, they aren't roots, they aren't leaves, but they can produce cells that can actually become all of these. So that they help to grow new stuff. Okay, so let's look at the dermal tissue of, let's say, a leaf. Okay, on the leaf, if you were to slice it vertically through the leaf and look at the edge of it, you would notice that there are clearly a top layer and a bottom layer of the leaf, the dermal layer, and just like our outside skin is called the epidermis, we call that the epidermis. Because they have a top and a bottom, we call it the upper epidermis and lower epidermis. We don't have an upper or lower because, you know, our bodies can face many different directions. So you have the outer one, that's the, or outermost layer is the epidermis. Leaves and young stems and roots all have these on the outside. Now, like trees, after a while, will have bark on the outside and things like that. Okay? If you also would look at the leaf, now it depends what kind of leaf you're looking at. You would, under a microscope, you might see it looks shiny on this top. And that shiny part is called the cuticle. It's a waxy layer, and it prevents the leaf from drying out. Now, if it's a plant, you know, that's going to grow where the conditions are really hot and dry, it'll probably have a thicker cuticle. Maybe like a plant that would grow in, let's say, Arizona, New Mexico, you know, where it's hot and dry. But if you have one that's growing in the rainforest, probably doesn't need much of a cuticle, right? Because it's pretty humid there, pretty moist. It probably won't lose much moisture, it won't dry out very easily. Okay? But the thing about that cuticle, it is secreted by the epidermis, and it is not alive. All the other tissues we're talking about are alive. They're actually made out of cells. This is not made out of cells. It's just a secretion. It's a waxy secretion. Now, sometimes as plants mature, you will have some of the cells that will die, and they're often they're part of the bark, and we call it cork. You know, like the cork they use for stoppers in wine bottles and things like that, or cork board that you can, you know, hang things up. I guess there's an example of a cork board over there. But these are actually dead cells. Remember when they were talking about cells originally? That's what he was actually looking at, and it reminded him of the little cubicles that monks would live in a monastery. But that's what cork is. They're actually dead cells. After they matured, the living cells are more inside toward the center of the plant. These are on the outside. Their main job is for protection. You know, an animal you can run into a tree and not kill the tree, because you might knock some of the bark off, but you know, the bark is for that job of protecting it. Okay, now let's talk about vascular tissue, the tissue that's responsible for carrying water and nutrients. And there are two kinds that plants have. One's called xylem, and its job is to transport water and nutrients, like from the roots up the plant ultimately toward the leaves, where they're going to need it to carry on photosynthesis. Then we have another kind of tissue. They're shaped a little bit different than the others, called phloem. And phloem kind of transport water and sort of like the food, the things that are produced back to other parts of the plant. You know, maybe back down to the roots so roots can grow, or to the stem where it can grow bigger, like in a tree with growing, getting bigger, more rings and stuff like that. So these typically carry, we always think of this as like food and water, and these are like nutrients and water, minerals and stuff that they get out of the soil. And their shape is a little bit different. Now, if you look at the vascular tissue, I know the title says ground tissue, we're going to set that aside for a moment, but these colored areas right here are places where they have xylem and phloem. In monocots, those are the monocotyledons that we talked about a moment ago. These are just kind of everywhere in the, like for instance, if you're looking at a stem, there's no pattern really to it. They're kind of pretty random. Sort of like if you were to look at a piece of celery that's cut off, you look at the end, you're seeing those little white spots in there are the ends of the vascular tissue, and they're just kind of random, right? They don't have any definite pattern. Now, if you were to maybe look like at a bean plant and look at the stem, and you would notice that the xylem and phloem is arranged in a circle. There's a real pattern to it. The cells on the inside that are bigger, and when you do our lab that we're going to do in dendrochronology, when we're going to actually look at a tree, a section of a tree that they call a cookie, we're going to look at that. You're going to see some of them that have big holes and thick walls, and then you'll see some places where they have smaller holes and thinner walls. This is the part that carries the water and nutrients up the plant, assume that direction's up, and this area right in here that has the little tinier ones carry food and water back down the plant, so that all parts have everything that they need. Now, the area in between here, these cells in here are called ground tissue, or they make up ground tissue, and their job is to provide support so that the plant just doesn't lay limp on the ground. And it also is a place where they store food. Like for instance, if you'd look at a tuber from a potato plant, you know, we just call it potato, on the inside, that white fleshy stuff, most of that is ground tissue. It's just storing starch. Its main job is to store food that the plant has produced through photosynthesis. Okay, back to the meristematic thing. They're like I said, sort of like our stem cells that can become any kind of tissue in our body. They're capable of doing that. Plants have those. These are the actual growing cells of the body. In other words, where they're actually making new cells for the plant to get bigger. These cells are like stem cells. They're not differentiated yet. They haven't become any specific kind of tissue. They're capable of becoming almost any kind of tissue.